Picture this. It's 1935, and your great-grandfather is standing in a bread line for the third time this week. Not because he's lazy or didn't plan ahead, but because the entire financial system just vaporized his life savings overnight. Meanwhile, the guys who crashed the economy are probably sipping cocktails on yachts they bought with other people's money. Sound familiar? Well, buckle up because we're diving into the mother of all financial disasters, the Great Depression. And trust me, once you understand how spectacularly America face-planted in the 1930s, you'll never look at economic bubbles the same way again. If you want someone to translate these giant economic faceplants into plain English so you don't repeat them with your own money, hit subscribe to Chill Financial Disasters now and stick around. Now, before we get into the blood and gore of financial collapse, let me set the scene. The 1920s weren't just roaring, they were absolutely screaming like someone set off fireworks in a library. Everyone was rich, or at least thought they were. People were buying cars, radios, and refrigerators like they were collecting Pokemon cards. Banks were handing out loans faster than candy at Halloween, and the stock market was going up, up, up forever. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. Absolutely everything. Here's what politicians and economists love to tell you about the Great Depression. It was an unexpected shock, a perfect storm of bad luck, something nobody could have seen coming. They'll throw around fancy terms like market correction and cyclical downturn, as if the entire economy didn't just explode like a meth lab in a tornado. But here's the thing they don't want you to know. The Great Depression wasn't some act of God. It was a masterclass in how to destroy an economy through greed, stupidity, and the kind of financial engineering that makes cryptocurrency look responsible. Every single warning sign was flashing red, but everyone was too busy counting their paper profits to notice the house was on fire. Let me walk you through exactly how America managed to turn the most prosperous decade in its history into a decade-long nightmare that still haunts us today. And by the end of this, you'll understand why your grandparents hoarded canned goods and never trusted banks again. The first wound in this economic autopsy starts with what I like to call the Roaring '20s hangover. Imagine waking up after the world's longest party only to discover you've maxed out every credit card in existence and someone's repossessing your shoes. That's America in 1929. The 20s weren't just about prosperity, they were about the illusion of prosperity built on a foundation of debt and wishful thinking. Everyone was buying everything on credit. Cars, appliances, stocks, you name it. The banking system had basically turned into a giant loan dispensary where the only qualification you needed was a pulse and the ability to sign your name. But here's where it gets really insane. People were buying stocks with borrowed money, sometimes putting down only 10% of the actual price. Think about that for a second. You could control $1,000 worth of stock with just $100. And pray your investment didn't implode faster than your relationships on social media. Meanwhile, productivity was growing, but wages weren't keeping up. Farmers were drowning in debt, producing more crops than anyone wanted to buy. Industries were pumping out goods faster than people could afford them. It was a classic bubble economy where everything looked shiny on the surface. But underneath, it was all duct tape and terrible decisions. The second major wound was what happened when reality finally showed up to the party uninvited. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The day the music stopped and everyone realized they were dancing on quicksand. Picture the New York Stock Exchange looking less like a trading floor and more like a zombie apocalypse movie. Brokers screaming into phones, fortunes evaporating in real time, and panic spreading faster than gossip in a small town. Over 16 million shares traded hands that day, but the only thing moving faster than stocks was pure, concentrated terror. Why did this happen? Because everyone genuinely believed the stock market would go up forever. I'm not exaggerating. There were actual economists arguing that America had entered a new era where market crashes were impossible. When you hear someone say, "This time is different," start running. That's not optimism, that's delusion wearing a three-piece suit. The aftermath was brutal. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment shot through the roof, and people lost their homes. Suicide rates rose because families went from middle-class comfort to selling furniture just to buy bread. It was one of the worst financial hangovers in human history, and no amount of coffee was going to fix it. The third wound was the complete collapse of the banking system. Here's a fun nightmare scenario. You walk into your bank to withdraw your savings, and the teller smiles politely and says, "Oh, that money? Yeah, funny story. It's gone." Welcome to the world of bank runs. Between 1930 and 1933, about 9,000 banks failed. That's not a typo. 9,000. Banks back then weren't insured, which meant when your bank went under, your money went under with it. And banks were collapsing like dominoes because they'd lent out all their deposits, invested in the stock market, or blown it on bad loans. The fear spread like wildfire. Even healthy banks got destroyed because panic is more contagious than any virus. People would line up outside branches desperate to withdraw cash, but the bank simply didn't have the money. It was like a magic trick gone horribly wrong. One moment your life savings existed, the next moment it had vanished into the Great Depression's black hole. This disaster eventually gave birth to the FDIC in 1933, which basically promised that if your bank screwed up, the government would cover your deposits up to a limit. Without that protection, people would probably still be hiding cash under their mattresses like their great-grandparents told them to. The fourth wound was unemployment hitting levels that would make today's economic problems look like a minor inconvenience. By 1933, unemployment reached nearly 25%. 1 in 4 Americans had no work. Imagine walking down your street and every fourth person you see is broke, hungry, and desperate. Factories shut down, farms collapsed, construction stopped. Even people who kept their jobs often worked fewer hours for less pay. Families survived by trading whatever they had left, furniture, jewelry, even clothes, just to get food. This wasn't the gig economy. This was the please don't let my children starve economy. And forget about government safety nets. Unemployment insurance didn't exist yet. If you lost your job, you were completely on your own. Charities and soup kitchens tried to help, but the lines wrapped around entire city blocks. Parents skipped meals so their kids could eat. Families lost their homes and built shacks in camps they sarcastically named Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover. The fifth wound was leadership that made a bad situation infinitely worse. President Hoover's entire strategy could be summed up as, "Don't worry, the market will fix itself." Spoiler alert, it absolutely did not. Hoover believed in something called rugged individualism, which basically translated to, if you're broke, it's your fault, not the economy's. Instead of giving direct aid to starving families, he tried things like asking businesses to voluntarily maintain wages and hoping corporations would do the right thing. Asking corporations to be generous during a depression is like asking sharks to become vegetarians. To be fair, Hoover did try some things. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks and businesses. But helping banks didn't exactly help families standing in breadlines. People needed cash, not trickle-down promises from failed institutions. Public anger grew fast. Those makeshift homeless camps spread across the country. When veterans marched on Washington demanding bonuses they'd been promised, Hoover's response was to call in the army with tear gas. That went over about as well as you'd expect. The sixth wound came courtesy of Mother Nature, who apparently decided the financial apocalypse wasn't quite apocalyptic enough. Enter the Dust Bowl, the ecological disaster of the 1930s that turned the American plains into a giant sandbox of despair. Years of overfarming combined with severe drought transformed states like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas into something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Massive dust storm swept across the landscape, choking crops, killing livestock and burying homes under dunes of dirt. Farmers already drowning in debt now had literally nothing left. Entire families packed up and fled west, hoping California would be their salvation. They were nicknamed Okies, even if they weren't from Oklahoma, and were often treated like dirt, which was ironically the one thing they had too much of. These dust storms weren't just inconvenient, they were deadly. People developed dust pneumonia, schools shut down, and livestock suffocated. At its worst, these storms carried hundreds of millions of tons of topsoil across the country in a single year. The land itself was having a complete mental breakdown. The Dust Bowl wasn't the direct cause of the Great Depression, but it made everything exponentially worse. The seventh wound was the social humiliation of a proud nation reduced to begging for basic survival. Welcome to fine dining Depression-era style. A cold bowl of watery soup and a piece of stale bread served after standing in line for 3 hours in the snow. Charities like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army did what they could, but the demand was overwhelming. Families who once enjoyed middle-class respectability now queued up alongside the homeless. The psychological damage was devastating. People's pride, dignity, and sense of stability just evaporated. Here's how crazy things got. Al Capone, the notorious gangster, set up one of Chicago's most famous soup kitchens, serving thousands of meals a day. Think about that. The guy who made his fortune from bootlegging and organized crime ended up doing more for hungry families than the actual government. When the mob boss looks more compassionate than the president, you know civilization has gone completely off the rails. The eighth wound was how this American disaster became a global catastrophe. The Great Depression wasn't just America's mess. It was like someone detonated a financial nuclear weapon and the radiation spread worldwide. The United States had been lending massive amounts of money to Europe after World War I, helping them rebuild and pay war debts. But when American banks failed, those loans stopped flowing. Europe was toast. Germany, already crushed under massive reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, completely collapsed under the pressure. The economic chaos and desperation gave rise to political extremism, including the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. In Britain, industrial output crashed. In France, production fell sharply. Across Latin America, exports tanked because nobody in America could afford to buy anything. International trade fell by about 2/3 in just a few years. It was like the entire global economy suddenly decided to stop working at the same time. The ninth turning point came when Americans finally got fed up with Hoover's positive vibes-only strategy and elected Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932. FDR rolled out the New Deal, which was basically a giant please don't let democracy collapse package. Roosevelt pumped government money into the economy through public works programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. These programs gave jobs to millions of people building roads, parks, dams, and schools. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept people employed and, more importantly, eating. He also implemented crucial reforms to stabilize the banking system and stock market. Deposit insurance through the FDIC, Social Security, and regulations to keep Wall Street from gambling with people's retirement funds like it was Las Vegas. FDR even got on the radio with his famous fireside chats to calm people down, basically creating the 1930s version of a presidential podcast. Did it fix everything immediately? Absolutely not. The Depression dragged on for another decade, but it stopped the free fall, restored some hope, and proved that government could actually do something useful instead of just standing around making speeches. The 10th major change was finally putting some rules on Wall Street's Wild West show. Before the crash, the stock market was basically an unregulated casino where anything went. Stock manipulation was considered a legitimate business strategy. Insider trading was practically a day job. Companies could sell shares in complete fiction and nobody would check. Want to pump up a stock price artificially and then sell before it crashed? No problem. Want to invent fake profits on paper and sell them to unsuspecting investors? Step right up. The system was so corrupt it made some modern scams look sophisticated. The collapse exposed just how insane everything had become. This led to the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which basically said, hey, maybe companies shouldn't lie to investors 24 hours a day. The Securities and Exchange Commission was born to watch over financial markets like an angry hall monitor. Did regulation eliminate greed? Of course not. But it forced transparency, made companies file actual financial reports, and occasionally slapped some wrists when insiders got too bold. It turned Wall Street from a full-on saloon brawl into a bar fight with a referee present. But the damage went far beyond money. The Depression created psychological scars that lasted generations. People's entire relationship with security, trust, and the future got permanently warped. Weddings became smaller affairs. Birth rates plummeted. Families doubled up in cramped houses because nobody could afford their own place. Unemployed people rode freight trains across the country searching for work, leaving chalk symbols outside homes to warn other travelers whether the family inside was generous or hostile. Entertainment became one of the few escapes. People flocked to movie theaters for cheap tickets, while Hollywood churned out escapist fantasies as reality starved just outside the theater doors. Radio became the voice of the nation, with FDR's chats providing comfort and comedians trying to keep spirits alive. But despair was everywhere. "Brother, can you spare a dime?" wasn't just a song lyric, it was daily reality for millions of Americans. The Depression left psychological wounds so deep that survivors carried them for life. Many never trusted banks again. Others became compulsive savers, hoarding every scrap because they'd learned how quickly everything could vanish. Financial trauma became a form of inherited PTSD that parents passed down to their children. Here's the brutal truth that nobody likes to admit. The Great Depression didn't really end because of smart policies or economic stimulus alone. It ended because of World War II, one of the most destructive wars in human history. The war supercharged industrial production on an unimaginable scale. Factories retooled to produce weapons, tanks, planes, and uniforms. Suddenly, unemployment evaporated because the government was throwing money at the war effort like there was no tomorrow. Millions of men enlisted, millions of women joined the workforce, and demand for everything skyrocketed. The economy didn't just recover, it absolutely exploded. By the time the war ended, the United States had become an industrial powerhouse and the richest country on Earth. The Depression was over, but only because global destruction had forced America to mobilize every resource it had. It's not exactly a comforting lesson, but it shows how massive government spending, even on warfare, can drag an economy out of the grave. Sometimes it takes the worst things in human history to undo the previous disaster. Even after the economy bounced back, the Depression haunted America for decades. Survivors lived with deep frugality, stashing food, saving scraps, and distrusting financial institutions. It shaped politics, economics, and culture in ways we still see today. The experience created the foundation for the modern welfare state and made Americans simultaneously wary of both unchecked capitalism and unchecked government power. The psychological scars remain visible today. Anytime markets wobble significantly, people immediately start whispering about the next Great Depression. Every generation since has carried that ghost in the background, a constant reminder of how fragile prosperity really is. You can recover money and rebuild economies, but trust, confidence, and genuine security take generations to heal properly. The Great Depression proved that when greed throws the party and panic calls the police, the entire economy ends up in jail. It showed how quickly a prosperous society can collapse into chaos when the financial system is built on fantasy rather than reality. But here's what makes this story relevant today. We're living through another era of massive debt, asset bubbles, and financial engineering that would make 1929 look quaint. Central banks are printing money faster than ever. Wealth inequality is reaching levels not seen since the 1920s, and everyone's convinced that this time really is different. Sound familiar? The tools and terminology have changed, but human nature and the fundamental mathematics of debt haven't. When you hear politicians and economists promising that modern financial systems are too sophisticated to fail, remember that they said the exact same thing in 1929. The real lesson of the Great Depression isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about recognizing the patterns that keep repeating. Follow the incentives and the money, not the speeches. Demographics, energy costs, and basic mathematics don't care about slogans or political promises. When everyone's convinced that prosperity is permanent and crashes are impossible, that's exactly when you should start paying attention. Because history might not repeat exactly, but it definitely rhymes, and right now it's starting to sound like a very familiar tune. So keep your eyes open, question the official narratives, and remember that the people who profit most from bubbles are usually the same ones telling you everything's fine. If you want more brutally honest breakdowns of the disasters hiding under the hood of the global economy, subscribe to Chill Financial Disasters and stick around, because understanding stories like this might be the only thing that helps you survive the next one.